In this video, we'll pick up with the healthcare model that we developed in the last video, and we will add that user-defined statistics. So in particular, what we want to track initially is the waiting time between when a patient arrives and when they see the medical professional. So for routine, moderate, and severe, it's going to be the time from when the entity arrives to the time they have an exam room and when the doctor or nurse gets there. For the urgent patients or the trauma patients, it's going to be the time from when they arrived until they get a trauma room, and then when the doctor or nurse gets there. So when we look at our model, recall this was the model that we constructed in the last video, and when the patient entities arrive, they follow a sequence that is specified by the treatment table, and they go through the sign-in, registration, exam room, treatment room, and so on. And what we did in the previous video was we added the doctor and nurse resource and demonstrated how to seize the secondary resources after the entity arrives in the respected room. So to track the waiting time, we need to make use of user-defined statistics. So I'm going to go back to my model, go to definitions and elements, and Simio supports three basic types of user statistics: output statistics, state statistics, and tally statistics. And for the waiting time, the first thing that we're going to do is use a tally statistic. And so in particular, what we want to do is we want to record that the time the entity arrives, which Simio actually does that automatically. We've seen that before. That's in model entity.time created. And then we want to capture the time when the doctor or nurse resource arrives in the exam room or the trauma room. And so that will give us the time between when the doctor or nurse resource arrives and when that entity was created will give us the first component of the waiting time that we're after. So to support that, I'm going to go back to my model and go to model entity definitions, and then I want to add a real state called waiting time. So the waiting time is a real state defined on the model entity object, and so in our model, then every realization or run space for all four of our entity instances will have that state called waiting time. And so what we need to do is record the value once we know what the waiting time is. And so as I mentioned, for the routine, moderate, and severe patients, their waiting time ends in the exam room when the doctor or nurse arrives. So when we look at processes, we can see that happens right here. So when the entity arrives, is allocated a room and arrives at the room, then they seize the doctor or nurse, and so the entities will wait right here until the doctor or nurse is available. And so at this point, I'm going to grab and assign, and then I'm going to assign the value model entity dot waiting time. So model entity dot waiting time, the value of the current simulation time, time now, minus model entity dot time created. And so what happens is when the entity arrives in the room, they seize the doctor or nurse in this case, and then when the doctor or nurse is allocated, we then assign the value of the current time minus the time created. So this is that initial component of waiting time. For trauma patients, we need to do the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this assign using Control-C and then paste it right here under trauma rooms. So now when patients arrive in the trauma room, the same thing happens. And so when the patients now depart, they'll have a waiting time state set to the time that the patient waited before they saw the first doctor or nurse. And so if we look back to our patient flow, we just handled that initial component of waiting time for exam and trauma. And so for routine patients, we're finished. But for moderate and severe patients and for urgent patients, After the exam or trauma, they go to the treatment, and so they potentially wait again for the second doctor or nurse. And so when we, or doctor and nurse, and so when we go back to our model, now we have a slightly different situation in that we already have a value in this waiting time. Furthermore, we can't use the interval between when the model the model entity was created and the current time, because they go through treatment. So they go through treatment, or they go through an examination, or they go through treatment in the trauma room. And so what we need to do at this point is between the C's and the before the C's and after the C's, we need to record the interval here that the entity was waiting for a resource. So I'm going to go back to my model entity and create another real state, and I'm just going to call this temp because it's a temporary holding place for me to store some information. So then I go back to my back to my processes, and right here in the treatment is the point of interest. So I'm going to assign, and I'm simply going to assign model entity temp to the current simulation time now. And now I can increment the waiting time. So now the after the C's, we're going to have model entity waiting time is simply equal to model entity waiting time plus time now minus model entity dot temp. Okay. So let's look at what's happening here. As I said, when the entity goes from the either the exam room to the treatment room, or from the trauma room to the treatment room, they release the doctor and nurse resources they were holding. They then are moved to the treatment room, at which case they wait for another set of medical resources. And so right here in this assign, what we're doing is just we're recording the current simulation time that the entity arrived. Then we seize the medical resources. Then when we come out of this seize, we have the resource. So the waiting time would just be the time spanned in this seize step. Then we can increment model entity.waiting time, which has already been assigned by either the when they arrived at the trauma room or the exam room, and we simply implement it by the interval current time minus model entity temp. And so now in our model, when an entity arrives at the normal exit, the entity state waiting time will have a value for the time that that entity waited for the medical professional. So now that we've defined the value, we need to tell Simio that we want to record that value in a tally statistic. So we're going to do this so that we can have a different waiting time for each one of our types of patients. So routine, moderate, severe, urgent. So we're going to go to our model definitions elements, and I'm going to create 4 tally statistics. And I'm going to call the first one, let's call this routine waiting. And then we will call the second one moderate waiting. And then we'll call the third one severe waiting. And then finally we'll call the last one urgent waiting. So we have 4 different tally statistics, and so as we've seen in earlier videos, the way a Simio tally statistic works is you define the tally statistic and then you tell Simio where you want to record the value. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our existing data table. So we already have a patient data table which defines our 4 entity types, and when we create entities, we already have a reference to the table. So we'll use that table reference in order to determine which tally statistic to use when we record a value. So to do that, I'm going to go to my data table, patient data, and add an element reference for my tally statistic. And for the routine patients, I'm going to pick routine weighting. For the moderate patients, I'll pick moderate weighting. For the severe, severe weighting, and the urgent, urgent weighting. And then finally, I'll name my column waiting time. So now we have a new column in our table called waiting time, and the waiting time column defines the specific tally statistic corresponding to that patient type. So if we go back to our facility, we want that to be recorded here at the normal exit. So what I'm going to do is select the input node, and then we can use the tally statistics property and simply say I want to add a tally statistic, and the statistic name is patient data waiting time. And the value that I'd like to record is model entity waiting time. Oops. Try that one more time. Model entity waiting time. And so this is the value that we recorded in the add-on processes. And then because I have the table reference, the corresponding tally statistic will be used depending on which type of entity is departing the system. And so now if we run our model, and we'll just run it in fast forward mode, and then go look at our results, you can see that we have our 4 user-defined statistics for moderate, routine, severe, and urgent waiting time. Of course, all of these waiting times seem pretty large, so we can go back to our model, of course, and we have it set up where we can control the capacity. So for example, if we just say, let's increase the nurse capacity to, let's just say 5 nurses. So we have 3 doctors, 5 nurses, and 6 exam rooms, 6 treatment rooms, and 2 trauma rooms. And so when we run in fast forward mode again, and then we go look at the results, and you can see that we have significantly reduced at least our mean waiting time. Our routine patients still have a fairly large waiting time, but of course this is all based on single replication of our model from which we can actually draw no conclusions. So what we wanted to do here, at least at this point, was just demonstrate the use of tally statistics. So again, in summary, what we did for the tally statistic is Simio automatically records the time that an entity arrives in model entity.timeCreated, and then for trauma patients and exam room patients, once the doctor or nurse was seized, we then recorded the value of waiting time, because we know once that time had occurred, we knew how long they'd waited. For then the treatment room, we had to use a temporary state, because we needed to record the waiting time for this component of the process, and then add that to our previously computed waiting time. And then when the entities departed, we then recorded the value using the tally statistic property from the input to the normal exit.